This is a story about love, after everything. Tell me where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. Translate this, and I'll wire you 10 million tonight. The laughter came easily to Ethan Blackwell, the kind of effortless laugh that belonged to a man who had never had to worry about the price of anything on the menu. In the private dining room of Halstead & Rowe, Manhattan's most talked-about restaurant that season, crystal glasses caught the warm glow of the chandelier and sent reflections dancing across the polished walnut table. Executives in tailored suits leaned back in their chairs, amused, curious, and slightly uncomfortable in the presence of a billionaire who could turn a joke into a transaction without blinking. Ethan Blackwell was 37, worth more than most people could imagine, and widely known for two things: building a tech empire faster than anyone predicted and testing the intelligence of everyone who entered his orbit. Tonight was supposed to be another routine business dinner, the kind where investors talked about global markets while quietly measuring each other's ambition. But Ethan had grown bored halfway through the appetizer, and boredom, for a man like him, often turned into mischief. Across the room, a young waitress moved quietly between tables, refilling glasses and clearing plates with a calm efficiency that almost made her invisible. Her name tag read Clara Bennett. Most of the guests had barely noticed her presence all evening, which suited Clara perfectly. She had worked the late shift at Halstead & Rowe for nearly a year, and she understood something important about rooms like this. The quieter you were, the more people revealed about themselves. Clara was 28, soft-spoken, with thoughtful gray eyes and the kind of posture that suggested patience rather than timidity. Her coworkers often described her as shy, but that word never quite captured the way she observed everything before speaking. As she approached Ethan's table carrying a bottle of sparkling water, the billionaire's attention drifted toward her almost by accident. It began with a small thing, the way she had corrected a pronunciation earlier while speaking briefly with the chef in the kitchen doorway. The language had sounded unfamiliar, something Eastern European perhaps, and Ethan's curiosity had flickered awake like a switch being flipped. He loved puzzles, especially the humankind. "Excuse me," Ethan said casually as Clara set down the bottle. His voice carried the relaxed confidence of someone who was used to being listened to immediately. Clara paused, polite but composed. "Yes, sir." Ethan slid a folded document across the table, the paper crisp and official-looking. Several guests leaned forward slightly. One of them chuckled under his breath, already sensing entertainment. "Translate this," Ethan said, tapping the paper lightly with one finger, "and I'll give you $10 million. The laughter that followed was quick and indulgent, the sort that wealthy people shared when a billionaire turned a moment into theater. One guest lifted his glass and whispered, "Careful, Ethan, she might translate the dessert menu instead." Clara looked down at the document. She didn't laugh. She didn't look flustered either. For a moment, she simply studied the page, her eyes moving slowly across the unfamiliar script printed in precise black ink. The room expected hesitation, maybe embarrassment, maybe a polite apology that she didn't speak the language. Instead, Clara's brow lifted almost imperceptibly. Ethan watched closely. He had spent years reading people across negotiation tables, noticing the smallest shifts in expression that revealed confidence or doubt. What he saw in Clara's face wasn't confusion. It was recognition. A small silence began to spread around the table, quiet enough that the soft clink of silverware from the main dining room could be heard through the open doorway. Clara lifted her gaze from the page and looked directly at Ethan Blackwell for the first time that evening. The billionaire's smile remained relaxed, but something in his eyes sharpened with interest. "Sir," Clara said gently, her voice calm and steady, "this isn't a translation problem." A couple of guests exchanged amused glances. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, intrigued. "Oh." Clara turned the paper so it faced him again and tapped a single line near the center of the page. "It's a trap." The words settled over the table like a sudden drop in temperature. The laughter stopped. One of the investors straightened in his seat. Ethan didn't laugh this time either. Instead, he leaned forward, elbows resting lightly on the table, studying Clara with a curiosity that replaced his earlier amusement. "That's a bold claim," he said quietly. Clara didn't look intimidated. She simply nodded once, as though confirming something obvious. "It's written to look polite," she continued, her tone still gentle. but the phrasing here changes the legal meaning of the agreement. One of Ethan's associates reached toward the document, scanning the lines she indicated. The man frowned. "You can read this?" Clara met Ethan's gaze again. "Yes." The room fell silent. Outside the private dining room, the hum of the restaurant continued as if nothing unusual had happened. But at that table, under the chandelier's steady light, Ethan Blackwell felt something he rarely experienced during business dinners. Surprise. For the first time that night, the billionaire realized that the quiet waitress standing beside his chair might be the most interesting person in the room. The word lingered over the table like a quiet echo. Trap. For several seconds no one spoke. Ethan Blackwell studied Clara Bennett the way a chess player studies a board after an unexpected move, not with anger, but with a growing interest that slowly replaced the amusement he had started with. Around them the private dining room felt suddenly smaller, the warm lighting no longer soft and relaxed but focused, almost like a spotlight. One of the investors cleared his throat. "What exactly do you mean by that?" he asked, leaning toward the document again. Clara did not rush to answer. She placed the bottle of sparkling water carefully on the table, aligning it beside Ethan's glass as if finishing the task she had started before the conversation had changed direction. Only then did she gesture toward the paper again. "The wording in the second paragraph looks friendly," she said calmly. "It sounds like a routine partnership agreement." Ethan tilted his head slightly. "But," Clara pointed to a phrase halfway down the page, her finger resting beside a line of characters that none of the men at the table could read. "But this part changes the entire meaning," she continued. "It is written in a dialect most translators would interpret loosely. In everyday conversation, it sounds cooperative. In legal language, it means control." The man seated to Ethan's right, a venture capitalist from Chicago, frowned and leaned closer. "Control of what?" Clara met his gaze without hesitation. "Control of the subsidiary mentioned earlier in the agreement." Another silence followed. Someone shifted in their chair. Ethan watched the room carefully. His business instincts were already calculating possibilities, risks, outcomes. He had seen deals structured cleverly before, but the confidence in Clara's voice was unusual. She was not guessing. She was explaining. "You are telling me," Ethan said slowly, "that a single phrase on this page could transfer ownership of part of my company." Clara nodded once. "Yes." One of the guests laughed nervously, the sound thin and uncertain. "That sounds dramatic for a dinner translation." Clara did not react to the comment. Instead, she looked back at Ethan. "Do you want me to read the line exactly as it is written?" Ethan did not answer immediately. He leaned forward, resting his forearms lightly on the table, studying Clara's face with focused curiosity. Her expression remained calm, patient, almost thoughtful. She was not trying to impress anyone. That detail alone made Ethan trust her more than if she had sounded confident and eager. "Go ahead," he said finally. Clara lifted the paper and spoke a sentence in the unfamiliar language, the sounds flowing smoothly, precise, and measured. The tone of her voice changed slightly as she spoke, reflecting the formal rhythm of the text. The words filled the quiet room like a soft current of sound. When she finished, the guests stared at her. One of them blinked twice as if he had just realized he had underestimated the wrong person. Ethan nodded once. "And the translation?" Clara lowered the paper and spoke again, this time in clear American English. "The company agrees to temporary cooperative oversight during the transition period," she recited. Several heads nodded. It sounded harmless. Routine. Then Clara continued. "But the final phrase states that operational authority may be reassigned if efficiency requires decisive leadership." Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. "Meaning?" Clara looked directly at him. "Meaning whoever wrote this agreement can legally claim the right to take control of the subsidiary if they argue that they can run it more efficiently." The venture capitalist leaned back slowly. "That is not a partnership." "No," Clara replied softly. "It is an invitation." Ethan let out a slow breath, the faintest hint of a smile returning to his face, but this time the expression carried respect rather than amusement. He picked up the document and examined the line she had pointed to earlier. He could not read the language, but he could see the careful structure of the text. It looked ordinary. That was the clever part. "Interesting," he murmured. One of his advisors spoke up immediately. "We should have legal review this again." Ethan did not take his eyes off the page. "We will." Then he glanced up at Clara. But first I would like to hear the rest of it. Clara tilted her head slightly. The rest. Ethan slid the document back toward her. You said it was a trap. He tapped the table once with his finger. Traps usually have more than one trigger. For the first time, a faint smile touched Clara Bennett's face. It was not a triumphant smile or a smug one. It was the quiet expression of someone who had expected that question. Around the table, several men leaned forward again, curiosity replacing the earlier laughter. The atmosphere had changed completely. An hour earlier, Ethan Blackwell had been the most interesting mind in the room. Now everyone was waiting for the waitress to speak. Clara Bennett held the document lightly between her fingers, the crisp paper catching the glow from the chandelier above the table. Around her, the room remained quiet in a way that no expensive restaurant ever truly was. The low murmur of distant conversations drifted in from the main dining area, but inside the private room, every person seemed to be listening to the same silence. Ethan Blackwell leaned forward slightly, his attention fixed entirely on the young waitress standing beside the table. A few minutes earlier, he had been entertaining himself with a casual challenge. Now he was studying her the way an investor studies a company that suddenly shows unexpected potential. You said traps usually have more than one trigger, Ethan repeated calmly. So tell us the rest. Clara nodded once, acknowledging the request without dramatics. She set the document gently on the table and turned it so the group could see the page again. The first part shifts control, she explained quietly. That alone would already be dangerous. One of the men at the table frowned. Already. Clara's eyes moved briefly toward him. Yes. She pointed again to the lower section of the page. But the real problem is here. The venture capitalist from Chicago leaned closer again, squinting at the unfamiliar script. That looks like the same language as the rest. It is, Clara said. But the tone changes. Ethan's expression sharpened. Tone. Clara folded her hands lightly in front of her, her posture still relaxed. In some languages, legal language is not only about vocabulary. It is also about formality levels. Certain phrasing signals obligation even if the sentence appears optional. The table grew quiet again. One of Ethan's advisors slowly nodded, recognizing the implication. Clara continued, her voice steady and measured. In this line, the wording suggests that the company receiving operational authority may appoint a temporary management supervisor. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. Temporary. Clara gave a small nod. That word sounds harmless in English. She paused briefly before finishing the sentence. But in the original language, it means the supervisor remains until the company proves it can operate independently again. The Chicago investor leaned back slowly. Which could take years. Or never, Clara said softly. The weight of the realization settled across the table like a quiet fog. Ethan picked up the document again and studied the page with renewed interest. His mind moved quickly, mapping possibilities. If Clara was correct, the agreement on the table was not a partnership offer. It was a carefully disguised path to corporate takeover. One of the executives spoke up, his voice tense now. We already reviewed a translated summary earlier this week. Clara nodded slightly. Most translators would interpret it that way. Ethan looked up sharply. Most. Clara met his gaze calmly. Yes. But not you. For the first time that evening, Clara hesitated for half a second. Not from uncertainty, but from consideration. Languages change meaning depending on context, she said carefully. And whoever wrote this agreement understands that very well. Ethan watched her closely. Something about the way she spoke suggested experience far beyond casual language skills. She was not simply translating. She was analyzing strategy. Where did you learn this language? One of the guests asked suddenly. Clara turned toward him politely. University. Ethan's eyebrow lifted slightly. Which one? Clara did not answer immediately. Instead, she gently slid the document back toward Ethan. If you would like, I can translate the remaining sections as well, she said. There are 2 more clauses worth examining. The billionaire allowed a faint smile to return to his face. You are avoiding the question. Clara gave a small, almost apologetic shrug. You asked about the document. A quiet chuckle escaped one of the investors. The tension in the room eased slightly, replaced by something closer to fascination. Ethan tapped the table lightly with one finger. Fair enough. He leaned back in his chair, crossing one arm casually while keeping his attention focused on Clara. Go on. Clara glanced once more at the page and then spoke again in the original language, reading a paragraph with smooth confidence. The rhythm of the words carried the formal cadence of legal text, precise and deliberate. When she finished, she looked back at Ethan and translated. This clause allows the supervising company to restructure staffing if operational stability requires it. Ethan's expression hardened slightly. Meaning layoffs. Clara shook her head gently. Not exactly. Then what? Clara's voice remained calm. It means they can replace leadership. The room went still again. One of the executives exhaled quietly. So if we signed this agreement tonight, Clara finished the thought for him. Within 6 months the subsidiary could legally belong to someone else. Ethan rested both hands on the table now, the playful mood from earlier completely gone. His eyes moved from the document to Clara Bennett again. There was no trace of arrogance in her posture. She had simply explained the truth. One of the investors finally broke the silence. Well, he said slowly, that changes the evening. Ethan nodded once. Then he looked at Clara with a thoughtful expression that was almost amused again, though this time the amusement carried genuine respect. Earlier tonight, he said, I offered you $10 million to translate this page. Clara waited quietly. Ethan folded the document neatly and placed it beside his glass. Now I am wondering something else. Clara tilted her head slightly. What is that? Ethan's smile returned, calm and curious. Why someone who can read a contract like this is working as a waitress in Manhattan? The question lingered in the air longer than anyone expected. Why someone who could read a contract like that was carrying a tray instead of negotiating across a boardroom table? Clara Bennett did not answer immediately. She simply stood beside the table with the same calm posture she had held since the beginning of the evening. The quiet confidence in her expression made the room feel slightly unbalanced, as if the invisible hierarchy everyone assumed had just shifted a few inches. Ethan Blackwell watched her carefully. Most people reacted to his questions quickly, sometimes nervously, sometimes eagerly. Clara did neither. She glanced briefly toward the door of the private dining room, where the distant sounds of the restaurant continued like a quiet reminder that the rest of the world had not stopped. Then she looked back at Ethan. Because this is where I work, she said simply. A few people at the table smiled at the understatement. Ethan leaned back in his chair again, studying her. That is technically correct, he said, but it is not an answer. Clara folded her hands lightly in front of her apron. You asked why I work here. I asked why someone with your skill set works here. She considered that for a moment. Life does not always follow the career plans people make at 20 years old. One of the executives chuckled softly. That might be the most honest statement in the room tonight. Ethan did not laugh this time. His attention remained steady. Where did you study? He asked again. Clara glanced at the document on the table as if the paper itself might offer an easier topic. I studied linguistics, she said after a moment, and international negotiation languages. The Chicago investor raised his eyebrows. That sounds like a very specific major. Clara gave a small nod. It is. Ethan tapped the folded contract once with his finger. Clearly it paid off. Clara allowed the faintest hint of a smile. Sometimes. Another quiet pause settled over the table. The earlier tension had faded, replaced by a different energy. Curiosity. Respect. A few minutes earlier Clara had been invisible to most of them. Now she had become the center of the conversation without raising her voice even once. Ethan picked up his glass of water but did not drink. You mentioned university, he said thoughtfully. Which one? Clara hesitated again, not out of embarrassment, but as if the name itself carried a story she did not feel like explaining in a crowded room. Columbia, she said finally. Several heads turned at once. One of the investors let out a soft whistle. That is not exactly a casual language program. Clara shrugged slightly. It was a long time ago. Ethan's eyes narrowed with interest. You did not finish. It was not a question. Clara met his gaze calmly. No, why not? For a moment it seemed as though Clara might decline to answer again. But instead she spoke in the same steady voice she had used all evening. My mother became ill during my second year, she said. Medical bills have a way of changing priorities. No one at the table interrupted her. The explanation was simple, but the meaning behind it was clear enough. Ethan nodded. Slowly. And instead of returning later, you decided to stay here. Clara tilted her head slightly. Restaurants are reliable work. Manhattan never stops eating. A few quiet laughs circled the table again, easing the mood. Ethan finally took a sip of water before setting the glass down carefully. Well, he said, I have to admit something. Clara waited. Ethan gestured toward the folded document again. Tonight that piece of paper might have cost me a very expensive mistake. Clara answered without hesitation. It is still your decision whether to sign anything. Ethan smiled faintly. True. One of his advisors leaned forward. We will definitely run a full legal review tomorrow. Ethan nodded but did not look away from Clara. Before tomorrow arrives, he said slowly, there is still the matter of my earlier promise. The Chicago investor grinned. You did offer $10 million. Clara shook her head gently. It was a joke. Ethan's smile widened slightly. Most jokes do not save companies. Clara remained calm. You did not hire me. No, Ethan said. But you solved the problem. She looked at him with mild curiosity now. So what exactly are you offering? Ethan rested both hands on the table, his tone thoughtful rather than dramatic. A conversation, he said. Clara blinked once, clearly surprised. The investors exchanged amused glances. Ethan continued. Not tonight. You are working. Clara nodded slowly. Correct. But when your shift ends, Ethan said, I would like to ask you a few more questions. Clara studied him carefully. For the first time since the evening began, Ethan Blackwell felt something unusual when someone looked at him across a table. Not intimidation. Not admiration. Evaluation. Clara Bennett was deciding whether the conversation would be worth her time. After a quiet moment, she gave a small nod. That seems reasonable, she said. Ethan leaned back with a satisfied expression. Around the table, several executives relaxed into their chairs again, the atmosphere finally returning to something closer to dinner rather than negotiation. But Ethan's attention remained fixed on Clara Bennett, the quiet waitress who had walked into the room carrying a bottle of sparkling water and somehow left holding the attention of the most powerful man at the table. The dinner gradually returned to motion, but the atmosphere around Ethan Blackwell's table had shifted in a way that no one could quite ignore. Plates were cleared, fresh glasses appeared, and quiet conversations resumed. Yet the focus of the evening had quietly moved away from contracts and toward the unexpected presence of the calm young waitress who had just dismantled a multi-million-dollar agreement with nothing more than careful reading. Clara Bennett continued working as though nothing unusual had happened. She refilled glasses, carried plates, and moved between tables with the same steady rhythm she had used earlier in the evening. If anything, she seemed determined not to draw attention to herself again. But Ethan noticed something else. The other servers occasionally glanced at her now with curiosity, clearly aware that something unusual had happened inside the private room. The billionaire leaned back in his chair, watching her as she crossed the dining room with a tray balanced easily in one hand. One of his investors followed his gaze and smiled knowingly. You are still thinking about it, the man said quietly. Ethan did not look away from Clara. Of course I am. The investor chuckled. You meet brilliant people every day. Ethan shook his head slightly. Not like that. Not like what? Ethan rested one arm along the back of his chair. Not the kind of person who sees the trap before the rest of us even realize there is a game. The investor glanced across the room again. Clara was speaking briefly with another server, her expression calm, her movements unhurried. She did not appear impressed by the attention from the table of executives. You think she knew what that document meant immediately? The investor asked. Ethan nodded once. Yes. Then why stay quiet until you challenged her? Ethan considered that for a moment. Because she was not trying to prove anything. The investor smiled. That might be the rarest trait in Manhattan. Ethan finally looked away from the dining room and toward the table again. The folded contract still rested beside his glass, a quiet reminder of how easily the evening could have gone differently. His legal advisor leaned forward slightly. I have already sent a message to our office, the man said. We will have the agreement analyzed first thing in the morning. Ethan nodded, though his thoughts had moved beyond the document. Good. The advisor hesitated before adding. You should still consider where that translation came from. Ethan raised an eyebrow. You mean Clara? Yes. What about her? The advisor lowered his voice slightly. Someone with that level of training working as a waitress is unusual. Ethan allowed himself a faint smile. Unusual does not mean suspicious. The advisor nodded slowly but did not argue further. Ethan's attention drifted back toward the dining room again. Clara had returned to the private room carrying a small tray with fresh coffee cups. She moved around the table quietly, placing the cups in front of each guest without interrupting the conversation. When she reached Ethan's chair, she set the cup down carefully beside him. "Your coffee," she said softly. Ethan looked up at her. "Thank you." Clara gave a polite nod and began to step away, but Ethan spoke again before she could leave. "What time does your shift end?" Several of the investors smiled, clearly enjoying the moment. Clara did not seem embarrassed by the question. She simply answered calmly. "Around 11:30. Ethan glanced at his watch. It was a little after 10:15. "That is not too far away." Clara tilted her head slightly. "Time tends to move quickly during the dinner rush." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "I will keep that in mind." Clara allowed herself the smallest hint of a smile before leaving the table again. As she disappeared back into the dining room, the Chicago investor leaned forward with an amused expression. "You are definitely planning that conversation." Ethan did not deny it. "Yes." The investor lifted his coffee cup. "Business opportunity?" Ethan shook his head slowly. Maybe. Ethan looked toward the doorway again, where Clara had just vanished behind a row of tables. "Or maybe I am simply curious." The investor laughed quietly. "Curiosity is expensive when you are a billionaire." Ethan's expression softened into something more thoughtful than amused. Sometimes curiosity is the reason someone becomes a billionaire in the first place. The room fell comfortably quiet again as the group resumed their dinner conversation, but Ethan's attention kept drifting back toward the dining room, where Clara Bennett moved through the restaurant with quiet efficiency. For the first time in a long while, Ethan Blackwell felt something unfamiliar during a business dinner. Anticipation. Not about a deal, not about a contract, but about a conversation that had not happened yet. By 10:45, the dinner rush had reached its peak, the main dining room of Halstead and Row alive with the soft clink of silverware, quiet laughter, and the steady rhythm of servers moving between tables. Outside the tall windows, Manhattan shimmered under late evening lights, the traffic below flowing like a river of white and red headlights. Inside the restaurant, the energy had shifted again. For most of the guests, the evening continued normally, but at Ethan Blackwell's table the conversation came and went in waves while his attention drifted elsewhere. Not constantly. Ethan was too disciplined for that. But every few minutes his eyes moved almost instinctively toward the dining room floor where Clara Bennett worked. The quiet waitress moved with the same calm efficiency she had shown all evening, balancing trays, exchanging brief smiles with guests, and answering questions from the kitchen staff with soft confidence. Nothing about her behavior suggested she had just interrupted a multi-million-dollar business negotiation. One of the investors noticed Ethan's gaze again and leaned slightly closer. "You are still watching her," the man said with quiet amusement. Ethan glanced back at him without embarrassment. "Observation is a useful habit. You sound like you were studying a company before buying stock." Ethan allowed a faint smile. "Perhaps I am." The man chuckled softly. "If you hire her, you might be the first billionaire in New York to recruit talent during dessert service." Ethan lifted his coffee cup but did not respond. Across the room, Clara spoke briefly with the restaurant manager near the service station, her expression thoughtful as she listened. Ethan noticed something subtle then. The manager seemed unusually respectful toward her, nodding more than once before returning to the kitchen. Clara did not appear surprised by the conversation. She simply adjusted the stack of menus in her hands and walked back toward the dining room. Ethan's curiosity deepened. This was not the behavior of someone hiding from responsibility or drifting between jobs. It was the posture of someone who had chosen where to stand. At the table, Ethan's legal advisor cleared his throat. "I reviewed the photograph of the contract again," the man said quietly. "She was correct about the structure." Ethan nodded once. "I expected that." "You expected it?" "Yes." The advisor frowned slightly. "Then why test the document in the first place?" Ethan rested his elbows lightly on the table. "Because sometimes the fastest way to understand a deal is to see who reacts when you question it." The advisor considered that answer for a moment. "And tonight?" "Someone did." Ethan's expression remained thoughtful. "Yes." The group gradually finished their meal as the evening moved closer to closing time. Plates disappeared, the last glasses were cleared, and the quiet buzz of the restaurant softened slightly as some of the earlier guests began to leave. By 11:15, the dining room looked calmer, the once crowded tables now half empty. Ethan checked his watch briefly. 11:30 was approaching. The Chicago investor noticed, and smiled knowingly. Your meeting is coming up. Ethan leaned back in his chair. It is not a meeting. Conversation then. Yes. The man lifted an eyebrow. You sound unusually patient. Ethan's smile returned, subtle but genuine. That is because the most interesting conversations rarely start on a schedule. Across the room, Clara carried a final tray of glasses toward the service counter before speaking quietly with another server who was finishing her shift. A few minutes later, she disappeared briefly into the hallway near the kitchen. When she returned, she was no longer wearing the black serving apron, only the simple white shirt and dark slacks that made up the restaurant uniform. The difference was small, but Ethan noticed immediately. She walked calmly toward the private dining room door. When Clara stepped inside, several of the investors greeted her with polite smiles. She acknowledged them with a nod before looking directly at Ethan. My shift is finished, she said simply. Ethan stood from his chair, an instinctive gesture of respect that caught the attention of everyone at the table. Thank you for coming back, he said. Clara glanced briefly at the empty plates and coffee cups before meeting his gaze again. You said you had questions. Ethan gestured toward the hallway leading out of the private room. Would you prefer to talk somewhere quieter? Clara considered the suggestion for a moment. The dining room behind them was still busy enough to make conversation difficult. Finally, she nodded once. That would probably be easier. Ethan turned toward his guests. Gentlemen, thank you for the evening. The Chicago investor grinned. Do not worry about us. We will survive without you for 10 minutes. Ethan laughed quietly before stepping toward the door beside Clara. Together, they walked out of the private dining room into the softly lit hallway that led toward the restaurant entrance. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The city outside waited beyond the glass doors, glowing under midnight lights. Ethan finally broke the silence. I appreciate you taking the time to talk after a long shift. Clara slipped her hands into the pockets of her coat, her expression calm but curious. You saved $10 million tonight, Ethan said lightly. The least I can do is ask how you did it. Clara looked at him for a moment, then gave a small, thoughtful smile. I did not save $10 million, she said gently. I just read the page more carefully than everyone else. Ethan studied her face for a second before shaking his head with quiet amusement. Somehow I think the story is a little more complicated than that. The hallway outside the dining room felt quieter than the restaurant behind them, the warm noise of late-night Manhattan fading into a softer hum of distant traffic and muted conversations. Ethan Blackwell pushed open the glass door and stepped outside onto the sidewalk where the cool night air carried the scent of the city after a long day. Clara Bennett followed a moment later, slipping her coat more securely around her shoulders as the wind moved lightly through the street. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Across the avenue, yellow taxis drifted past beneath streetlights, their reflections sliding across the polished windows of nearby buildings. Ethan rested one hand in his coat pocket and looked toward the skyline before glancing back at Clara. You handled that room better than most corporate attorneys I know, he said calmly. Clara gave a small shrug. Attorneys focus on winning arguments. And you do not. She shook her head slightly. I focus on understanding the sentence before anyone starts arguing about it. Ethan smiled faintly. That explains a lot. Clara leaned lightly against the metal railing beside the restaurant entrance, her posture relaxed but attentive. The quiet confidence she carried inside the dining room seemed even more natural out here beneath the open sky. Ethan studied her for a moment before speaking again. Earlier tonight, you said the story might be more complicated. Clara tilted her head. Most things are. Ethan nodded. Then I would like to hear the complicated version. Clara looked out toward the passing cars for a few seconds, as if deciding how much of that story belonged in a conversation with a stranger. Finally she spoke. When I started studying languages at Columbia, I thought I would eventually work in international diplomacy. Ethan's eyebrow lifted slightly. That would make sense. Languages are not only about translation, Clara continued. They are about power. The way a sentence is structured can decide who controls the outcome of a negotiation. Ethan listened closely, his expression thoughtful. And you learned that early. Clara nodded once. One of my professors used to say that the most dangerous contracts are the ones written to look friendly. Ethan laughed quietly. I wish I had taken that class. Clara smiled slightly. You probably did not need to. Most entrepreneurs learn the same lesson eventually. Ethan leaned back against the brick wall beside the door. Usually after losing money. Usually, Clara agreed. The streetlight above them cast a soft glow across the sidewalk as a taxi slowed near the corner before continuing down the avenue. Ethan watched the passing traffic for a moment before turning back to her. Your professor must have been proud of you. Clara's expression changed just slightly, the calm confidence giving way to a brief hint of reflection. He was, she said quietly. Ethan noticed the shift immediately. What happened after that? Clara exhaled slowly, not with sadness, but with the steady patience of someone who had already made peace with the past. My mother became sick, she said again. When you are 21 years old and hospital bills begin arriving every week, international diplomacy stops feeling very urgent. Ethan nodded slowly. So you left school. For a while. Clara looked back toward the restaurant entrance where a few late diners were leaving. At first I planned to return the next semester. Ethan noticed the careful wording. But you did not. Clara shook her head gently. Life rarely waits for plans. Ethan studied her for a moment. You do not seem like someone who gives up easily. Clara's eyes met his. I did not give up. Then what? She smiled slightly. I adapted. The answer hung in the air for a moment. Ethan recognized the tone. It was the voice of someone who had faced difficult decisions without turning them into dramatic stories. Working here pays the bills, Clara continued. And the hours allow me to take care of my mother. Ethan looked back toward the glowing restaurant windows. That explains the job. Clara nodded. Yes. But it does not explain the skill. Clara raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Ethan gestured lightly with one hand. Most people who step away from a specialized field forget the details after a few years. Clara smiled softly. Languages do not disappear that easily. Ethan shook his head. Neither does the kind of thinking you showed tonight. Clara did not answer immediately. The quiet between them felt comfortable rather than awkward. Finally she spoke again. Sometimes skills stay with you even when your career changes. Ethan studied her face carefully. That sounds like something someone says when they are waiting for the right moment to return. Clara considered the idea before responding. Maybe. Ethan smiled again, the expression thoughtful rather than persuasive. You know, he said slowly, most people in my world spend years searching for advisors who can see problems before they happen. Clara looked at him with quiet curiosity. And tonight one of them served you coffee. Ethan laughed softly. Exactly. Clara folded her arms lightly against the evening chill. Are you about to offer me a job, Ethan Blackwell? Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead, he watched the lights of the city reflecting in the glass door behind her before looking back at her face. Not exactly, he said. Clara tilted her head again. Then what are you offering? Ethan's smile returned, calm and genuine. An opportunity to stop hiding your talent in a dining room. Clara Bennett did not answer immediately. The quiet street outside the restaurant held a steady rhythm of distant traffic and glowing streetlights, but in the small space beneath the awning the moment felt still. She studied Ethan Blackwell carefully, the way she had studied the contract earlier that evening, as if she were examining the meaning behind his words rather than the words themselves. You think I am hiding, she said calmly. Ethan did not look offended by the question. If anything, he seemed amused by the accuracy of her observation. I think you are someone who understands value, he replied. And right now you are placing yours somewhere most people would overlook. Clara folded her arms lightly against the cool night air. Working here is not hiding. Ethan nodded. No, it is surviving. She tilted her head slightly. That sounds like a judgment. Not a negative one. Ethan said quickly. Most people underestimate survival. It is one of the hardest strategies to maintain. Clara allowed a small, thoughtful smile. You speak like someone who built a company from nothing. Ethan's expression softened. I did. Clara looked toward the traffic for a moment before returning her attention to him. Then you understand something important. Ethan waited. Sometimes the best move is not expansion, she continued. Sometimes it is stability. Ethan nodded slowly. True. And right now stability matters more to me than ambition. Ethan leaned slightly against the railing beside them. Because of your mother. Clara gave a small nod. Yes. The word was simple, but the weight behind it was clear. For a moment neither of them spoke. The city around them continued moving, but the conversation had settled into a quieter rhythm, the kind that happens when two people realize they are no longer talking about business. Ethan finally broke the silence. What if stability did not require you to stay here? Clara looked back at him with mild curiosity. What do you mean? Ethan gestured lightly toward the restaurant behind them. You are using your intelligence to carry trays instead of shaping negotiations. Clara smiled faintly. Carrying trays pays medical bills. Ethan considered that answer for a moment. And shaping negotiations pays more. Clara raised an eyebrow. You are persistent. Ethan laughed softly. It is a professional habit. Clara looked thoughtful for a second before speaking again. You said earlier that you were not offering me a job. I did. Then what exactly are you suggesting? Ethan glanced toward the glowing windows of the restaurant, then back at her. Something smaller. Clara waited. Consultation. She blinked once, clearly surprised by the word. Ethan continued calmly. Not a full-time position. Not a corporate contract. Just occasional review of international documents when my company encounters languages or phrasing that could create misunderstandings. Clara studied his face carefully, searching for exaggeration. You already have attorneys for that. Yes, Ethan admitted. But attorneys think like attorneys. Clara smiled slightly. And you think I think differently. Ethan nodded once. Tonight you read the intention behind the sentence before anyone else realized there was intention to read. Clara considered the offer silently. A taxi slowed near the corner and then continued down the avenue, its headlights briefly illuminating the sidewalk. Finally she spoke. Consultation still requires time. Of course. And time is the one thing I do not have much of. Ethan leaned forward slightly. What if the consultation could be done remotely? Clara frowned slightly, considering the idea. Emails, Ethan explained. Occasional video calls. Documents sent for review. Clara thought about that for a moment. You are serious. Ethan nodded. Completely. And you trust someone you met less than 2 hours ago with sensitive business material? Ethan smiled faintly. You saved me from signing a document that could have cost my company hundreds of millions of dollars. Clara shrugged lightly. I simply translated it. Ethan shook his head. You interpreted it. The difference between the two words hung quietly between them. Clara looked down the street again, thinking carefully. Even if I agreed, she said slowly, I could not guarantee immediate availability. Ethan spread his hands slightly. I am not asking for immediate availability. Clara glanced back at him. Then what are you asking for? Ethan's voice remained calm and steady. A chance. Clara studied him again. The same thoughtful gaze she had used all evening. Most billionaires are not patient enough to ask for chances, she said quietly. Ethan smiled. Most billionaires never meet someone who interests them enough to try. Clara did not look away this time. The streetlight above them cast a soft reflection in her gray eyes as she considered his words. Finally she spoke. If I say yes, she said slowly, it will not be because of the money. Ethan nodded immediately. I would expect nothing less. Clara allowed herself a small smile. And it will not be because you are persuasive. Ethan laughed quietly. That might hurt my ego. Clara shook her head slightly. It will be because I am curious whether you are as thoughtful as you sound tonight. Ethan's smile grew warmer. That seems like a fair condition. Clara extended her hand toward him. Then we can start with one document at a time. Ethan took her hand gently, shaking it once. One document at a time, he agreed. And in that quiet moment beneath the lights of Manhattan, neither of them realized that the simple agreement they had just made would eventually change far more than a single contract. The handshake lasted only a second, but something about the moment lingered longer than either of them expected. Clara Bennett withdrew her hand calmly, slipping it back into the pocket of her coat as the cool night air moved along the avenue. Ethan Blackwell remained where he was for a moment, studying her expression with quiet interest. The agreement they had just made was simple, almost casual. Yet both of them understood that simple decisions often created the most unexpected changes. A taxi slowed near the curb, its driver glancing briefly toward them before continuing down the street. Clara followed the movement with her eyes before looking back at Ethan. You should probably return to your guests, she said gently. Ethan glanced toward the glowing windows of the restaurant behind them. Inside, the remaining investors were finishing their drinks and conversation. They will survive a few more minutes, he replied lightly. Clara smiled faintly. Billionaires do not usually abandon their meetings halfway through dessert. Ethan shrugged. Tonight was already unusual. Clara tilted her head slightly. Because of the contract? Ethan looked at her for a moment before answering. Because of the person who noticed it. Clara did not respond immediately. Compliments seemed to slide past her in the same way the city traffic slid past the sidewalk, acknowledged but not collected. After a moment she spoke again. If you send the document tomorrow, I will take a look. Ethan nodded. I will. And if there is nothing unusual about it? Ethan smiled faintly. Then I will owe you coffee instead of consultation fees. Clara raised an eyebrow. You are assuming I drink coffee outside of work. Ethan laughed softly. You caught that detail. Observing details is part of the job. Ethan nodded thoughtfully. I am beginning to understand that. A quiet pause followed as the wind shifted slightly between the buildings. Clara glanced toward the restaurant entrance again. I should go inside for a moment, she said. I need to collect my bag before I leave. Ethan stepped aside to open the door for her. Of course. Clara paused briefly before entering. Good night, Ethan. The way she said his name carried the same calm confidence she used in conversation, not formal and not overly familiar. Ethan inclined his head slightly. Good night, Clara. She disappeared through the glass door and into the warm light of the restaurant lobby. For a moment, Ethan remained outside on the sidewalk, watching the reflection of city lights in the window. His phone vibrated softly in his pocket. He pulled it out and glanced at the screen. A message from his legal advisor appeared. Contract analysis scheduled first thing tomorrow morning. Ethan typed a short reply confirming the instruction before slipping the phone away again. Through the window, he could see Clara speaking briefly with the restaurant manager near the front desk. The older man nodded respectfully as she gathered a small bag from behind the counter. There was a quiet professionalism in the exchange that Ethan noticed immediately. Clara did not behave like someone who felt trapped in her job. She behaved like someone who had chosen it for a reason. A few minutes later she stepped back outside. The street looked calmer now as the night grew later, the steady rhythm of traffic slowing slightly. Clara adjusted the strap of her bag over her shoulder. Sorry about that, she said. Closing routines. Ethan shook his head. No need to apologize. Clara glanced down the avenue before looking back at him. I usually take the subway home. Ethan gestured lightly toward the corner where a line of taxis occasionally passed. Would you like a ride? Clara considered the offer for a second before shaking her head. I appreciate it, but the subway is faster at this hour. Ethan nodded, accepting the answer without argument. Then I will not try to change your routine. Clara smiled faintly. That might be the first time someone with your level of influence has said that. Ethan laughed quietly. Influence works better in business meetings than on subway schedules. Clara took a small step toward the curb, as if preparing to leave. I will watch for your email tomorrow. Ethan nodded. You will receive it. For a moment neither of them moved. The city around them seemed to pause in the same quiet rhythm their conversation had found. Clara finally broke the silence. It was interesting meeting you tonight, she said. Ethan's expression softened slightly. The feeling is mutual. Clara gave a small nod. Good night, Ethan. Good night, Clara. She turned and began walking toward the subway entrance down the block, her pace unhurried and steady. Ethan remained where he was, watching until the crowd of late-night pedestrians gradually blended around her and she disappeared beneath the glow of the station stairs. Only then did he turn back toward the restaurant entrance. Inside, the last of his investors were gathering their coats and preparing to leave. As Ethan stepped back through the door, he realized something that made him smile quietly to himself. For the first time in years, the most interesting negotiation he had encountered did not involve money, companies, or contracts. It involved a quiet waitress who had agreed to read one document at a time. The next morning Manhattan woke under a pale gray sky that promised rain by the afternoon, and inside a glass tower 30 floors above the street, Ethan Blackwell sat alone at the long conference table in his office reviewing the document again. The city moved below him in steady patterns of traffic and people rushing to begin their day, but Ethan's attention remained fixed on the printed pages spread in front of him. The legal team had already arrived earlier that morning with their own analysis. 3 attorneys, 2 analysts, and a senior advisor had spent nearly an hour discussing the structure of the agreement. Every conclusion they reached pointed to the same unsettling truth Clara Bennett had identified within seconds. The contract had been written to look cooperative while quietly transferring control over time. Ethan leaned back in his chair and looked toward the tall windows that framed the skyline. He was not surprised that Clara had been correct. What surprised him was how clearly she had seen the trap when a room full of professionals had missed it. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," Ethan said. His legal advisor stepped inside holding a tablet and a folder. "We finished the full analysis," the man said. Ethan gestured toward the chair across the table. "Sit." The advisor did as he was asked, placing the folder down. "Your waitress friend was right," he said without hesitation. Ethan allowed a small smile at the phrasing. "Her name is Clara." "Clara," the advisor corrected with a nod. "The clause about operational authority is structured to create a delayed takeover scenario. If we had signed the agreement as written, we would have given them the legal framework to replace the subsidiary leadership within 18 months. Ethan folded his hands on the table. "And the second clause?" "Even worse," the advisor admitted. "The restructuring language could allow them to appoint their own management team." Ethan looked down at the contract again. "Interesting." The advisor studied him carefully. "You do not seem surprised." "I am not," Ethan said calmly. "But I am curious." "About the deal?" Ethan shook his head slightly. "About Clara Bennett." The advisor leaned back thoughtfully. "I looked into her briefly this morning." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Already?" "Basic background check," the advisor explained. "Nothing invasive." Ethan nodded. "And?" The advisor opened the tablet and scrolled for a moment. "She did attend Columbia University exactly as she said." Ethan leaned forward slightly. "Did attend?" "Yes," the advisor continued. "She studied linguistics and international negotiation language structures. Her professors described her as one of the strongest students in the program." Ethan smiled faintly. "That does not surprise me." The advisor looked up again. "But she withdrew during her second year. Medical situation involving her mother," Ethan said quietly. The advisor nodded. "Yes, that matches the records we found." Ethan stood from his chair and walked toward the windows overlooking the city. "And after that, part-time work while caring for her mother. Eventually, she began working at the restaurant where you met her." Ethan watched the movement of traffic below as he absorbed the information. The story matched exactly what Clara had told him. No exaggeration. No attempt to impress him with unnecessary details. Just the truth. Behind him, the advisor closed the tablet. "There is something else," the man added. Ethan turned slightly. "What?" "Her professors wrote several recommendation letters for her before she left the program. They expected her to enter international diplomacy or corporate negotiation consulting." Ethan nodded slowly. "She still might." The advisor studied him for a moment before asking the question he had clearly been holding back. "Are you planning to bring her into the company?" Ethan returned to the table and picked up his phone. "Not exactly." The advisor frowned slightly. "Then what?" Ethan opened his email application and began typing. "One document at a time," he said. The advisor blinked in mild confusion. Ethan finished typing and attached a scanned copy of the contract to the message. The subject line read simply, "First document." He added a short sentence beneath it. "Curious what you notice after a full night of sleep." Then he entered Clara Bennett's email address, which she had written on a small card before leaving the restaurant. Ethan hesitated for a moment before pressing send. The advisor watched him carefully. "You trust her that much already?" Ethan set the phone down on the table. "I trust what I saw." The advisor considered that answer quietly. "Which was?" Ethan smiled faintly. "Someone who reads between the lines before most people realize. There are lines to read." Outside the window, the city continued its morning rhythm, unaware that somewhere beneath its skyline a quiet waitress had just become part of a conversation happening 30 floors above the street. Clara Bennett read the email during a quiet moment in the late afternoon while sitting at a small kitchen table beside the apartment window. Outside, rain had finally begun to fall over Manhattan, soft droplets tracing slow lines down the glass while the city moved in muted gray tones beyond the street. The apartment itself was modest but clean, the kind of place where every piece of furniture had been chosen for practicality rather than decoration. A kettle hummed quietly on the stove while Clara studied the message on her laptop screen. The subject line was simple. First document. She smiled faintly when she read it. Ethan Blackwell had not exaggerated when he said he would send something quickly. The attachment opened easily, revealing the same contract she had glanced at the night before in the restaurant's private dining room. Clara leaned back slightly in her chair and reread the message beneath it. "Curious what you notice after a full night of sleep." The tone was calm, almost playful, but the intention behind it was clear. Ethan wanted confirmation that her interpretation had not been a coincidence. Clara rested her elbow on the table and studied the document carefully again. The language was exactly as she remembered it. Polite phrasing, cooperative tone, quietly dangerous structure. She read the agreement slowly from the beginning, her eyes moving across each paragraph with the patient attention she had developed years earlier in her university classes. Outside, a car splashed through a puddle on the street below, but Clara barely noticed the sound. The document contained several additional details she had not pointed out the night before, not because she had missed them, simply because the conversation had not needed them. Now she examined every line again, translating each sentence into English while noting the subtle legal implications hidden in the phrasing. When she finished reading the final paragraph, she closed the file briefly and stared out the rain-covered window. The agreement was even more carefully structured than she originally suspected. Whoever wrote it understood not only the language, but also the psychology of negotiation. Clara reopened the document and began typing a response. She did not rush. Each sentence she wrote was precise and measured. The email grew gradually into a short but detailed explanation of the clauses she had noticed. She highlighted 3 sections that could eventually allow control of the subsidiary to shift ownership without direct confrontation. Then she added something Ethan's attorneys might not have seen yet. A paragraph near the end of the contract contained a timing structure that allowed the transition process to begin automatically after a performance review period. Clara finished the explanation and reread it carefully before sending the email. The clock on the kitchen wall read 4:15 in the afternoon. Across the city, Ethan Blackwell's phone vibrated softly on the conference table during a meeting with 2 senior advisors. Ethan glanced at the screen briefly and saw Clara's name appear in his inbox. He opened the message immediately. His advisors paused their conversation as he read through the explanation line by line. The longer he read, the more thoughtful his expression became. Clara's analysis was clear and structured, almost identical to the way a professional consultant might outline risk factors in an international agreement. When he finished reading, he placed the phone on the table and looked up at the 2 advisors across from him. Well, one of them said cautiously, "What does she think?" Ethan smiled slightly. She found 3 more traps. The advisors exchanged surprised glances. Ethan lifted the phone again and read one sentence aloud from Clara's message. The most effective contracts rarely force control immediately. They simply create conditions where the transfer becomes inevitable. One advisor leaned forward. That is exactly how this agreement is structured. Ethan nodded once. Yes. The room fell quiet for a moment. Finally, the second advisor spoke. Your Waitress consultant might be the best risk analyst we have encountered in years. Ethan leaned back in his chair and looked toward the window where the rain continued to fall across the skyline. Her name is Clara Bennett, he said calmly, and she reads contracts like most people read novels. The advisors remained silent, considering the implication. Ethan looked down at the phone again and typed a short reply. I see them now. Thank you. There was a brief pause before he added another sentence. Coffee still stands if you are willing. When he pressed send, he realized something unusual had happened during the past 24 hours. A conversation that began with a casual challenge in a restaurant had turned into a partnership built entirely on quiet respect. And somewhere across the city, a woman who carried trays during dinner service had just proven that she could outthink an entire boardroom. 3 days later, the rain had cleared and Manhattan returned to its usual restless rhythm. The sidewalks crowded again and the glass towers reflecting a pale autumn sun. Ethan Blackwell stood near the tall windows of his office, reviewing another international agreement that had arrived earlier that morning. The document was shorter this time, only 6 pages long, but he read it more carefully than usual. Not because the contract itself was complicated, but because he had developed a new habit. Before making any decision, he waited for Clara Bennett's perspective. His phone vibrated softly on the desk behind him. When Ethan turned and picked it up, he saw a message from Clara. The subject line was simple. Reviewed. He opened the email and smiled almost immediately. Clara's response was concise but precise, exactly the way her previous analysis had been. She had identified a translation inconsistency in the 3rd paragraph, a phrase that appeared neutral in English but carried an obligation tone in the original language. It was not a trap like the previous agreement. but it still revealed how easily meaning could shift when contracts moved between cultures. Ethan leaned back in his chair as he reread the explanation. Over the past few days, Clara had reviewed 3 different documents for him. Each time, she found something subtle that his advisors had either overlooked or considered too minor to question. None of the discoveries were dramatic. That was the surprising part. Clara's strength was not dramatic revelations. It was clarity. She simply noticed what others rushed past. Ethan replied with a short message thanking her and confirming that the correction would be made before the agreement moved forward. A moment later, another message appeared from Clara. Coffee still stands if schedules allow. Ethan laughed quietly when he read the sentence. The invitation felt simple, almost casual, yet he knew it represented something more meaningful than a typical business meeting. He checked the clock on the wall. It was just after 4 in the afternoon. Without hesitation, he typed his reply. Name the place. Across the city, Clara read the response while standing behind the counter at the restaurant during a brief pause between lunch and dinner service. The dining room was mostly empty, the quiet hours when servers restocked supplies and the kitchen prepared for the evening rush. Clara looked at the message for a moment before typing back. Small cafe on 9th Avenue. 6 o'clock. Ethan confirmed immediately. 2 hours later, the small cafe smelled of roasted coffee beans and fresh bread as the late afternoon sunlight filtered through the front windows. Clara arrived first, choosing a small table near the corner where the street could be seen clearly through the glass. She ordered tea and waited patiently, watching pedestrians pass along the sidewalk outside. At exactly 6 o'clock, the door opened, and Ethan Blackwell stepped inside, scanning the room until he saw her. He walked toward the table with the same calm confidence he carried in boardrooms. But there was something slightly different about his expression now. It was lighter, less guarded. Clara noticed it immediately. You are early, she said as he sat down. Ethan smiled faintly. I prefer punctuality. Clara lifted her teacup slightly. Good habit. A barista approached the table, and Ethan ordered coffee before turning his attention back to her. For a moment, they simply observed each other, both aware that their previous conversations had revolved around contracts and professional curiosity. This time the atmosphere felt different. Ethan broke the silence first. Your analysis this morning saved us from another misunderstanding. Clara shrugged gently. It was a small detail. Ethan shook his head. Small details are usually the ones that matter most. Clara studied him thoughtfully. You are learning that quickly. Ethan smiled. Good teachers help. Clara laughed softly, the sound warm and genuine. It was the first time Ethan had heard her laugh outside the formal rhythm of conversation. The moment felt unexpectedly natural. The barista returned with Ethan's coffee, and the quiet hum of the cafe continued around them as the evening approached. Ethan lifted the cup and glanced toward Clara again. You know, he said thoughtfully, 3 days ago we met because of a contract. Clara nodded. Yes. Ethan set the cup down slowly. And now we are meeting because of coffee. Clara smiled faintly. That seems like progress. Ethan held her gaze for a moment before answering. It might be more than that. Clara did not look away. Outside the window, the sun slipped lower between the buildings, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. Inside the cafe, the quiet conversation between a billionaire and a waitress continued, no longer about contracts or negotiations, but about 2 lives that had unexpectedly crossed paths in the middle of a Manhattan evening. The cafe grew quieter as evening settled over the street outside, the warm glow of hanging lights reflecting softly against the windows while pedestrians moved past beneath the fading daylight. Clara Bennett wrapped her hands around the warm teacup in front of her, while Ethan Blackwell sat across the table, listening with a calm attention that no boardroom meeting had ever demanded from him. Their conversation had drifted far from contracts and negotiations, moving instead through stories about places they had lived, professors Clara remembered from her university years, and the strange realities of building a company from nothing. Ethan spoke about the early days of his business when he worked from a borrowed desk and spent nights reviewing investor emails until sunrise. Clara listened with interest, occasionally asking quiet questions that made him pause and reconsider moments he had not thought about in years. It surprised him how natural the conversation felt. There was no pressure in the room, no negotiation strategy hidden beneath their words. For the first time in a long while, Ethan realized he was not trying to impress anyone. Clara noticed it as well. You are different outside your office, she said gently at one point. Ethan looked mildly amused. Is that a compliment? Clara smiled softly. It is an observation. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, considering the comment. Most people only meet the version of me that signs contracts. Clara nodded. And that version probably works very well in business. Ethan laughed quietly. It does. He paused for a moment before adding. But it does not always work in ordinary conversations. Clara lifted her teacup again. You are doing fine so far. Ethan smiled at the reassurance. The cafe door opened briefly as two students stepped inside to order coffee, bringing with them a swirl of cool evening air before the door closed again. The city lights outside had begun to glow brighter as night approached, and the comfortable quiet between Ethan and Clara seemed to deepen with the passing minutes. Eventually, Clara glanced toward the clock on the wall. I should probably head home soon, she said. My mother will start worrying if I am late. Ethan nodded with understanding. How is she doing? Clara's expression softened slightly. Better lately. The treatments are helping. Ethan felt a quiet sense of relief hearing that. I am glad. Clara met his eyes for a moment, noticing the sincerity in his voice. It was the same calm respect he had shown during every conversation they had shared since that night in the restaurant. Not once had he treated her situation like a weakness or a problem to solve. He simply listened. That alone had changed the way she saw him. Ethan lifted his coffee cup again before speaking. You know, he said thoughtfully, when I walked into that restaurant a few nights ago, I thought the most important decision of the evening would be whether to sign a contract. Clara smiled faintly. And now? Ethan looked at her with quiet honesty. Now I think the most important decision might have been asking you to translate it. Clara laughed softly, shaking her head. You offered $10 million as a joke. Ethan shrugged slightly. It was not the smartest negotiation strategy. Clara leaned forward slightly, resting her arms on the table. But it did start an interesting conversation. Ethan nodded. Yes, it did. For a moment, they simply looked at each other across the small cafe table, both aware that something subtle had changed between them during the past few days. What began as curiosity had slowly turned into respect, and respect had begun to feel like something warmer and more personal. Clara finally broke the silence. You know something interesting about languages? Ethan tilted his head. What is that? Clara smiled gently. Sometimes the most important meaning is not in the sentence itself. Ethan leaned forward slightly. Where is it then? Clara held his gaze for a second before answering. In the pause between words. Ethan understood the meaning behind her comment immediately. A slow smile spread across his face. Outside the cafe, the lights of Manhattan reflected against the pavement, while the quiet evening continued around them. Clara stood and gathered her coat, and Ethan rose with her. They walked together toward the door, stepping out onto the sidewalk where the cool night air greeted them once again. For a moment they stood beneath the streetlight, just as they had a few nights earlier outside the restaurant, but this time the atmosphere felt different. Clara adjusted her bag over her shoulder. Thank you for the coffee, she said softly. Ethan nodded. Thank you for the conversation. Clara began to turn toward the subway and tranced down the block, then paused briefly. You know, she said, one document at a time might turn into something bigger. Ethan looked at her with quiet curiosity. What do you mean? Clara smiled warmly. Sometimes partnerships start with simple agreements. Ethan stepped a little closer, his voice calm but sincere. Then I am glad we started with one. Clara met his eyes again beneath the glow of the streetlight, and for a moment neither of them felt any hurry to leave. The city moved around them as it always did, full of noise and motion and opportunity. Yet in that quiet moment it felt as though the world had paused long enough for two very different lives to find the same direction. And neither Ethan Blackwell nor Clara Bennett realized that the conversation, which began with a single sentence in a restaurant, would soon become the beginning of something far more meaningful than any contract either of them had ever signed. If this story touched your heart and reminded you that intelligence and kindness can appear in the most unexpected places, please take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who loves powerful stories, and subscribe to Love After Everything channel for more cinematic storytelling. Your support helps us continue creating meaningful stories that inspire, move, and stay with you long after the video ends.